2000 Jetta. Turning the ignition key on, nothing happens in the dash, and the key feels kind of loose as well. Most likely the ignition lock cylinder, or the cylinder that holds the key, the end piece is broken off, so it's not turning the ignition switch, because I don't feel any spring action here. The spring action is from the ignition switch. The spring action that you feel when you crank it and you let go, the key springs back. That's part of the ignition switch. So since I don't feel that, I don't think it's an ignition switch problem. It's most likely the lock cylinder. But in order to get the car started, obviously in order to move it, you need to get at the ignition switch. So what I do, first you remove this little pad here. There's 2 torque screws and one here. Worn here, I think it's a T25. You'll figure it out. So 1 here, 2 here, so you can move this. This is for your height adjustment for the steering wheel. Then you gotta remove this cover. So there's this Phillips screw here and a Phillips screw there, and then 2 on the top. So that's 1. There's a second one. And then there should be 2 in here. Ideally you want to remove the steering wheel, but this can be done with the steering wheel in place. There's 1 more. I'm not sure if I gotta get a different screwdriver. This one's a little longer, and it should be small enough, even though it's a flathead, it's small enough to get into the Phillips slots. So that's 1 of them that's loose. Here's the other one. And the trick is just to lift this up so that it can be dropped or lowered. You might have to go in from the top and move the Phillips screw out of the way. And then you just lower the plastic out of the way. Here's the 2 extra screws. Put the steering wheel back on. So now you have access to the ignition switch right here. Again, my assumption is that the lock cylinder in here is busted. So what you can do, get rid of this paint mark, remove this lock screw a little bit, First the harness plug. Oh yeah, there's a second one here. It's been a while since I did an ignition switch. So you got the 2 locking screws free. Ignition switch is already free now too, you can see it wiggling. Pull out the ignition switch. There you go. Ideally you want to remove this body panel as well. Obviously the more room the better, as with anything. I'm just kind of rushing it here. So then you plug the switch back in. And get a better screwdriver. This key is too big. Nice flat screwdriver. So now you can turn this into the ignition on position, and you can see everything comes to life. Ignition just locked because I took the key out. You're going to need the key to start the vehicle because the computer reads the chip. I believe this thing has a coil. Yes, there's a coil here that identifies the key via the chip that's in the key. So vehicle should start in park. Okay, now it's not reading the key right now. Let's try that again. Yeah, so I did read the key, or it is reading the key. So now I can at least drive the vehicle. It got towed in. At least I can start it like this the next day, and then drive it to a location where it's not going to be in the way. And then we disassemble the ignition or the steering column so that we can replace the key cylinder part of it. So yeah, this is just a quick way on how to get a car started when turning the key, instrument cluster lights don't come on. So first clue, obviously right now it won't turn off unless I manually turn the ignition switch. So first clue that the only clue that you need for when the key, to determine if it's an ignition switch problem or a lock cylinder housing problem, is when you turn the key, nothing comes on, no warning lights. And then also when you turn it into the crank position and let go, there is no spring back action. And again, that spring back action is built into the ignition switch here. So ignition switch is in. Turn the ignition switch to the on position. Warning lights are on. Crank it, and you'll watch as soon as I let go, it springs back on its own. There you go. So the spring action is in the ignition switch. 2000 Jetta, everything looks stock because again these paint marks here, or the security marks, the security paste was still intact. So in this case, even though the problem is here, at this point I would still do the ignition switch as well, because odds are the ignition switch is going to fail down the road. It may not be for another year, could be as early as a month from now. If I'm going through all this trouble to replace this lock cylinder, I might as well replace the ignition switch at this point, because it is still stock, still the original. Parts only last so long. Yes, it'll be extra cost, but customer won't be back within a short time for an ignition switch. Obviously, if they don't want to go for the ignition switch, I'm just going to deal with this lock cylinder. Thanks for watching.